Since the invention of cars, people have been racing down roads with a lot more than just what we're seeing today. The secret behind the smooth ride isn't just fancy tires or powerful engines, it's the unsung hero of suspension systems.
Do you know who I am? Do you know who I am?
These systems work by using springs to absorb bumps, shock absorbers to control bouncing, and control arms to keep the wheels aligned. This setup is the reason your car can cruise over potholes or bumpy roads without spilling your coffee. From the basic setups that keep your family comfortable to high-tech designs used in military tanks to stop anti-tank weapons in their tracks, there are a lot of suspension systems that we're going to be talking about in this video. Now, what are car suspension systems? The suspension is there to keep things comfortable and safe by soaking up those pesky road bumps and jolts. When you're cruising along and hit a bump, your tires have to deal with it. They push up and down, and without the suspension, that bump energy would just slam into your car's frame. Not exactly a recipe for a smooth ride, more like an uncomfortable roller coaster. And let's face it, the last thing you want is your car playing hopscotch on the road. Now, let's take a trip back in time. Ever wondered how people coped with bumpy rides before modern suspensions? Back in the 17th century, ox-drawn carts had a pretty rudimentary suspension system. The cart swung on iron chains. I mean, imagine a cart trying to do the cha-cha every time it hit a bump. By the 18th century, they upgraded to leather straps called thorough braces. It was basically an early form of car suspension, but without all the fancy tech. Then, around 1750, the leaf spring was introduced. These were like the early version of today's springs, designed to absorb bumps and keep rides smoother. They were the first big leap in modern suspension, and together with better road construction, they made travel way smoother.
Damn!
Imagine the excitement when Obadiah Elliott came along with the first patent for a spring suspension vehicle. Each wheel had a couple of strong steel leaf springs on either side, and the body of the carriage was bolted right into these springs, which were hooked up to the axles. Within a decade, British horse carriages were decked out with springs, wooden ones for light, single-horse rides, and steel springs for the larger, heavier carriages. Fast forward to 1901, and things get even cooler.
Wait for it. Here it comes. Almost there.
Moors of Paris decided to add shock absorbers to an automobile. Henry Fourner took advantage of this new damped suspension system to win the prestigious Paris to Berlin race on June 20th, 1901. It was like having the best suspension at the Olympics. He totally crushed it. The leaf springs stuck around for a while, and while they've evolved, their core idea of making rides less bumpy is still with us today. Now, before we talk about the types of car suspension systems, let's quickly talk about the components of your car suspension system. First up, springs are the backbone of this whole setup. They're like a car's shock-absorbing superheroes, keeping those tires hugging the road despite all the bumps. Now, you've probably heard of coil springs and leaf springs. They're the most common types. But next, we have shock absorbers, or just shocks if you're feeling casual. These guys work alongside the springs to keep things steady. They're the ones making sure your ride isn't a bumpy mess by controlling how the springs bounce back and forth.
I know, I got it.
Struts are another key player. They're the suspension system's support squad. They hold up the vehicle's weight, housing the spring and shock absorber, and keep your wheels in line. So, if you're ever wondering who's making sure your car doesn't tip over when you turn a corner, it's the struts.
Grandma, it's me.
Control arms are like the middleman, connecting your wheels to the car's body. They let your wheels move up and down, but also make sure they don't swing side to side too much. Without them, you'd probably end up with your wheels doing their own thing, and that's not ideal for smooth driving. Then we have sway bars, or stabilizer bars. They're like the car's balance experts, making sure your ride stays steady during turns. They link up the suspension components on each side of the vehicle to evenly spread out the forces. Another component is the bushings. Bushings are the unsung heroes, absorbing vibrations and cutting down on noise. They might be small, but they make a big difference, making sure your ride is as quiet and smooth as possible. Ball joints are the movers and shakers. They let the suspension parts pivot and move, connecting control arms to the steering knuckles. They're crucial for steering and make sure everything stays in check.
Yeah, boy.
Tie rods are like the steering system's connectors that link up the steering mechanism to the wheels, making sure your steering is responsive and your wheels stay aligned. If you want your car to go where you point it, thank the tie rods.
Thank you so much.
Lastly, the lower and upper arms are like a suspension's friendly assistants. They keep the wheels attached to the car chassis and let the suspension parts move both up and down. They help with turning and keeping things stable. So, when it comes to car suspensions, you've got two main types, dependent and independent systems, and then two more that are worthy to mention. Let's talk about the dependent suspensions first. Imagine them as a team of wheels that are basically glued together. They've got a beam or axle that keeps them in line, so when one wheel changes its angle, the other wheel has to follow suit. If one does a flip, the other's got to do the same. Let's look at the most common types of dependent suspensions you might come across. First up, there's the pin-hard run suspension system. This system contains a bar extending laterally in a similar plane as the axle, connecting one end of the axle to the vehicle's car body or chassis on the other side. It's like a high wire act where the bar can only sway up and down, letting the axle move vertically but not side to side. Then there's Watt's linkage suspension system. This setup is like a fancy chain reaction of 3 bars. The central bar stays in a straight line and it's hooked up to 2 outer bars. All 3 bars can pivot around some bolts, letting the suspension handle movement in a more controlled way. Now, why would you want a dependent suspension? Well, they're strong. They can handle heavy loads like a champ, making them perfect for off-roading and towing.
Oh my god! Wow!
Kind of like the workhorses of the suspension world. They're also similar to make and maintain, which is great news for anyone who doesn't want to spend a fortune on repairs. It's like getting a solid, reliable tool that doesn't break the bank. But of course, they're not without their quirks. Because the wheels are connected by that solid axle, they can't move independently. So, if you're off-roading and hit a rough patch, the wheels might not keep up with their terrain as well as you'd like. It's like trying to dance with your shoes tied together. Hard to adapt to the bumps and dips. Plus, they're not the best at soaking up shocks and vibrations, which means your ride might feel a bit bumpier.
No, God!
Anyways, let's move on to the next type, which is the independent suspension system. Imagine your car's wheels are doing their own thing, like they're at a dance party where each one has its own playlist. That's the beauty of independent suspension. Each wheel can bounce around on its own without messing with its buddy on the other side. Unlike dependent suspensions, which tie the wheels together like a pair of overly coordinated dance partners, independent suspension lets each wheel handle bumps and dips without causing a chain reaction. If one wheel hits a pothole, the other wheel can stay calm and collected. Most modern rides sport independent front suspension because, let's be honest, nobody likes a bumpy ride up front.
Okay.
And if you've got independent rear suspension, that means the back wheels are also getting their own space. A fully independent suspension system means all 4 wheels are on their own little islands, each enjoying their own smooth ride. So, why is this setup so great? Well, with independent suspension, if one wheel encounters a bump, it doesn't mess up the other wheel's game. This means better traction and a smoother ride. Now, let's break down some of the coolest types of independent suspension systems you might find. First up, we've got the double wishbone suspension. This system uses 2 wishbone-shaped arms to keep the wheel in check. Each arm is like a knight protecting its wheel, with the shock absorber and coil spring riding along to handle any vertical movements. Then there's the multi-link suspension. This design first made waves in the 1960s on the Mercedes-Benz C111 prototype and later showed up on their W201 and W124 series. Next, we've got the McPherson strut. This is the most popular front suspension system body. It's a simple but effective design where a strut-type spring and shock absorber work together like a dynamic duo. It first got its groove on in British Ford in the 1950s and later made its way to BMW and Porsche. It's especially loved in front-wheel drive cars for its space-saving magic.
Magic.
Lastly, let's talk about the traverse leaf spring. This system uses a single, curved spring to support the wheel. Although it's not as common these days, you might still find it in classic models like the Corvette or a few Volvos. Next, we have the semi-independent suspension system. They're the middle ground between the best of both worlds. In a semi-independent suspension system, the wheels on the same axle are connected, but can still move a bit independently. One wheel's position affects the other, but not as dramatically as in dependent systems. This connection happens through some clever twisting or deflecting of suspension parts under load. You'll often find these setups in entry-level cars and light-duty trucks. One of the most common semi-independent systems is the twist beam. So, why would you go for a semi-independent suspension? For starters, they strike a good balance between comfort and cost. Thanks to that independent wheel movement, they offer a smoother ride compared to dependent systems. It's better at soaking up those shocks and vibrations. Another bonus is cost savings. Semi-independent suspensions are generally cheaper to produce than fully independent systems. However, they do have some disadvantages. While they're an improvement over dependent suspensions, they might not handle as well as fully independent systems, especially during aggressive driving or tough road conditions. If you plan to take your car off-road or tackle heavy-duty tasks, a semi-independent system might not be up to the challenge. It's like having a versatile tool that's great for everyday use, but not quite the heavy-duty workhorse. Now, let's take a closer look at air suspension systems. Instead of using traditional metal springs, air suspension systems rely on air bladders. These bladders are like the inflatable pool toys of the car world. They can be pumped up or let down with an onboard air compressor. As the compressor works its magic, the vehicle can rise and lower, changing how the car handles and feels on the road. There are two main types of air suspension systems: pressure-based and height-based. Let's break them down. Pressure-based systems are like the car's personal trainer, using air pressure to pump up or deflate the vehicle. They come with an air compressor, an air tank, regulating valves, and shock absorbers. Think of the air compressor as the engine behind the scenes, pumping up the vehicle's ride height to match your needs. Want to clear that rocky path or avoid a pothole? Just adjust the air pressure and your ride height changes accordingly. On the other hand, height-based systems are like having a personal assistant for your car, constantly checking its height and making adjustments. The sensors on each wheel keep track of the vehicle's height and adjust the air pressure to keep things level, no matter how many passengers or how much luggage you've got on board. If you're cruising over bumpy terrain or dealing with uneven loads, this system helps keep your ride smooth and balanced. But like all fancy features, air suspension systems have their downsides. They can be pretty pricey to install and maintain, kind of like owning a high-end gadget that needs frequent updates. And if something goes wrong, repairing it can be a bit of a wallet buster. So, while air suspension offers a premium ride experience and can adjust to your every whim, it might also come with a hefty price tag. Do you think military cars and tanks use the normal suspension system used in our cars? Well, no, they don't. Imagine trying to navigate a tank that weighs over 70 tons. These beasts need suspension systems that can handle anything from rough terrain to the occasional landmine without missing a beat. Tracked armored fighting vehicles, the ones with those big, grippy tracks, can sport up to 9 road wheels on each side. It's like having an extra set of wheels to spread the weight around and keep things moving smoothly over rocky or muddy ground. To keep these hefty machines rolling in tough conditions, they sometimes come with a central tire inflation system. This feature lets the driver adjust the air pressure in the tires to suit the terrain. And let's not forget, these suspension systems aren't just about keeping the ride smooth, they also need to be tough enough to handle some serious threats. The components are designed to be protected from landmines and anti-tank weapons. It's like having a bulletproof vest for your car's suspension. So, when it comes to car suspension, it's all about how they keep your ride smooth and comfortable. Whether it's the dependent suspension system, the independent suspension system, the semi-independent suspension system, or the fancy air suspension system, each type helps your car handle bumps and rough roads better. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe for more informative content, and hit that bell icon to stay updated with our latest videos.